All right, so our next section is going to be on retrieval. So we've talked about how we encode it, which is, changing it into a form that we can keep it, which is storage and the different ways and places that our brain processes and stores our memories. But now kind of one of the most important parts is actually getting it back out, because this is the biggest problem for a lot of people, is not only just trying to actually remember it, but then once you have remembered it, once you've studied it, once you feel like you've learned it, how do you get it back out? So there's three processes to memory retrieval. We have recall, okay, which is just this asking a question and filling in the blank. Okay, we have recognition, which is this idea that you can recognize the correct answer. Okay, and then we have relearning. Okay, and relearning is kind of like you knew it and you kind of are restudying it, and it comes quicker. Okay, so recall, recognition, and relearning are kind of the 3 R's of memory retrieval. Now, lessons from each of these kind of demonstrations that we have talked about is that our storage and recall capacity is virtually unlimited. Okay, our capacity for recognition is even greater than our capacity for recall, and our relearning can highlight that there are memories are there that even if we can't recall forming them. Okay, so a lot of the relearning stuff is things that you didn't even really realize you were learning in the first place, a lot of the automatic processing kind of stuff. Okay, so the 3 R's of memory retrieval: recall, recognition, and relearning. Now, relearning is kind of, relearning time sometimes is used as a measure of retention. How well do we know something? How well have we, really put it into and encoded it and stored it into our memory? So it was first studied by a guy named, in the late 1800s, by a guy named Urban Ebbinghaus. Okay, and he studied another measure of memory and function. How much time does it take to relearn and regain mastery of material? Well, so what he did is he studied the memorization of nonsense syllables, TBH, YOX, KVU. And the reason why he did the nonsense syllables is because so that there's no meaning there that could have kind of altered his memory, so that depth of processing or pre-learning would not be a factor. And what he found is that the more times he rehearsed out loud on day 1, the less time he needed to relearn or memorize the same letters on day 2. So as you can see in the chart, as rehearsal increases, relearning time decreases. So basically what this is telling us is that the more times you kind of rehearse it initially, the better you encode it, the better you store it, and the less time it takes for you to kind of relearn that list on subsequent days. So again, this is an important thing you can apply to your studying. Anytime that you are studying a chunk of material, you should really take the time to rehearse that material well, because when you go back and review it subsequently, what Ebbinghaus found is that we will be able to recall it and relearn it faster. Now, priming, in terms of, retrieval, there are some things called retrieval cues that are important ways of activating our associations, and priming is one of them, okay? So priming triggers a thread of associations that bring us to a concept, just as a spider feels movement on a web and follows it to find the bug. So remember when we talked about how we store our memories, and we store our memories in this kind of like net of neural networks throughout our brain, and there's all these kind of keywords. We don't necessarily store a memory as a whole. We store these keywords that then trigger and activate this web. Okay, priming is one way that we can start to activate one of those kind of threads of associations. So our minds work by having one idea trigger another, and this maintains kind of our flow of thought. So a priming example: if I were to tell you to define the word bark, what are you thinking about right now? Now, what is the definition of bark? Oops. So how many of you, for the first was where I said define the word bark, said a tree, it's the outside of a tree. And then your definition of the word bark the second time was a dog's noise or something along the lines. Did it work for you? So what is some of the power of priming? Well, priming has been called invisible memory because it affects us on a very unconscious level. So in the case of the tree bark versus the dog bark, the path that we follow in our thoughts can be channeled by priming. Okay, we also may have biases and associations stored in our memory that influence our choices. So in a study, they found that people primed with money-related words were less likely to help another person. Priming with an image of Santa Claus led kids to share more candy, and people primed with missing child posters then misinterpreted ambiguous child-adult interactions as kidnapping. So we do know that there's definitely some power in priming, and it can definitely play a role. And we'll talk about this more in class, and I'll give you some more examples of this. Now, there's also something called context-dependent memory, and part of the web of associations that we've been talking about, of memory is the context. What else was going on at the time we formed the memory? We retrieve a memory more easily when it's in the same context as when we formed the memory. So, for instance, did you forget a psychology concept? Just sitting down and opening your book might bring back the memory. Just picturing the bright orange book might be enough. Just shutting your eyes and imagine being in our classroom, okay, when we were talking about something and hearing my voice could trigger it. Sitting down and picturing this video that you're watching and trying to remember, okay, Mrs. Bailey was wearing a bright purple sweater when she was talking about this, okay, or her hair looked a little wonky tonight, okay, and maybe just sitting down and doing that kind of mental imagery might serve enough of a context clue for you to recall what we were talking about. Now, in some studies, they found that, trying to test this idea of context-dependent memory, they found that words learned underwater are better retrieved underwater, and words learned on land are better retrieved on land. Now, there's also something called state-dependent memory, and our memories are not just linked to the external context in which we learn them, but they're also tied to our emotional state we were in when we formed the memory. So, mood-congruent memory refers to the tendency to selectively recall details that are consistent with one's current mood. Kind of like we talked about, when you're in a bad mood, it's very rare that you're going to remember things that are happy things. You're probably going to look at situations and recall all of the other bad, negative things. And vice versa, when you're happy, you're probably going to be able to recall happy moments much better than you are going to be recalled sad moments. Okay, so this biased memory then reinforces our current mood. It's kind of like, when you're in a bad mood, it's really hard to snap out of it because everything else is bad. So memories can even be linked to physiological states. So just a little funny for you. I wonder if you'd mind giving me directions. I've never been sober in this part of town before. And we'll talk about this in class. Now, the last thing, the serial position effect. We played around with this in our memory Olympics. So priming and context clues are not the only factors which make memory retrieval selective. Okay, the serial position effect, which tells us that we remember the stuff at the beginning and the end, the primacy and the recency effects. Okay, and like we talked about and like we demonstrated with my shopping list, we remember the stuff at the beginning because we're ready. We remember the stuff at the end because it was the last stuff we recalled. The stuff in the middle gets kind of jumbly and kind of confusing because we're overwhelmed, there's too much going on, okay, and that kind of situation. But the serial position effect is a powerful effect that we need to understand in terms of, how our memory and how retrieval of our memories work. All right, so next time we are going to talk about forgetting.